I remember the first time that I remember being in any kind of church building. And for me, that was called the church. I didn't know there was any kind of difference, right? That's the church. The building, that's the church. And I was a kid. Some other kid invited me. I was kind of on my own, so I could go. And I remember being such a foreign place to me. That pillars, everything was so white and clean. It was unlike any other space you'd ever be in. And I remember being shushed a lot. I don't remember interacting with any adults at any close range. It was almost like being herded a little bit. And somehow I ended up in the big room. Maybe a bunch of kids were in the big room at one time. But I do remember feeling like I am in a foreign place. And this is under different rules and different guidelines than I was used to. And so the idea that this kid I knew and all these other people came here all the time, it felt like, oh, this is like a club you're born into. I knew there were other resorts and clubs around, and so I just assumed, they paid to get into those. And I knew enough then at that age to know you don't have to pay to be in a church. But the thought was you kind of have to be on the inside to be here. And so when you see this passage in Luke chapter 4, where it says that Jesus came to Nazareth, where he had been brought up, his childhood place, he came there, and as was his custom, as was his habit, he entered the synagogue. So it was his habit, it was Jesus' habit to be at synagogue. And the reference here is in his hometown. Now, we do know that Jesus spent a lot of time in synagogues teaching. It was his primary place to go and teach. So he'd go to different synagogues wherever they traveled, and he'd walk in on the Sabbath, which is Saturday morning, and he would walk in and they would give him the opportunity to teach because he was a rabbi. But in this situation, it's different because it's his hometown. He'd grown up there. As a kid, he was the kid that grew up going there. In fact, synagogue is really just another name for church, and church is just another name for synagogue. And so for us to understand why it was his habit to be there, we need to understand synagogue a little better. So I'll give you a brief understanding, a brief background on synagogue. The history of it is a little muddled. But for the most part, we know that after the people of Jerusalem, the people of Israel, were exiled to Babylon, and the temple was destroyed. And the temple's not a synagogue. The temple was like people couldn't just walk into temple. That was just for priests and Levites and people high up religiously. And so when they were in Babylon, they had to find a way to just kind of be together because something was missing. And Ezekiel, the book of Ezekiel, refers to this as a prophecy that God will provide a sanctuary. And so they had this sanctuary, which was to be together. And so these naturally formed groups began, these synagogues, no buildings, just synagogues of the people of God who gathered together to encourage each other, to pray with each other, and especially to read Torah. Torah is just another word for the scriptures, the first 5 books of the Bible, or the law. And they read that so they could be reminded of what God commanded. So they wouldn't lose sight of who they were and to whom they belonged. And so these synagogues, when the exile ended, people continued these little sanctuaries, these groups, and they were scattered everywhere. And then eventually, when they'd be in towns, they started creating the buildings. Because it's something about having your own space. It was like, this is the place that we gather. We're going to set this aside for prayer, for studying God's word, and for being together. And so they created these these spaces, but they were more like community centers. Not only did they have worship there on Saturday mornings, but they would also do community gatherings. They would do meetings. Anything that kind of happens at a community center today is kind of what happened there. And so they would all get together, and it was their space. And so when we think of these synagogues, they were assemblies or they were congregations, and then they got buildings. And just like with churches, churches is a people, not a place. And the synagogues were a people, not a place, but they started creating places. And so the word kind of got interchanged. But here's the thing that it strikes me that I want us to close with, is that Jesus had this habit of going to synagogue. But in all the times that he would go, and we have at least 10 times it's recorded in the New Testament of him doing things at the synagogues. He would heal, he would teach. But nowhere do we see him trying to change it. It was his custom, and he accepted it as it was. The simplicity of it, where the people gathering from the community to be together and to connect with God, especially by God's word. So today, when we have typical church, a lot of what we do comes from that ritual. They would have prayer, and then they sometimes would have prayer with music. But for the most part, they gathered to look at God's word together, because that's what bound them, was God himself. And they knew enough about themselves to say, look, we really need to stay close to God's word, because we so easily veer off. And it began when they were in a foreign land, but even when they came back, it can still feel like you're in a foreign land sometimes. And I thought, he didn't try to change it. He just considered himself a member in any synagogue. And so one of the habits was at these synagogues is they would get together and they would have set scriptures that would be read, sometimes up to 7. And it would be divided between the people that were there. And so if you were of a certain age, then you could give an interpretation. So not only would you read it, but you could give an interpretation. They're usually pretty short. So nowadays, churches, people will go 45 minutes to an hour and a half. That wasn't the case. They were actually kind of short. And so when you look at that, I just think it is such a habit of us as a people now to complain about the way church is done. And yet that just never came up. And if anybody should complain, it would be Jesus, right? So what do we do with this? What do we take with this? Well, number one, Jesus was a member of synagogue. He was a member of the people of God. If anyone could set themselves aside, it would be him. He chose not to be above it. We have no record of Jesus trying to change synagogue. We do know that in Luke chapter 4, as we just read, it continues on and says that he read from Isaiah 61:1 and said, I am the fulfillment of this. I am the Messiah. So he's adding, he's putting his interpretation in. And at first they hear that and they're like, okay, that sounds great. But they didn't really hear what he was saying. And then he just laid into it, made it really clear. No, I'm the Messiah and you won't accept it because this is where I grew up. They didn't like that. And so the happy faces disappeared and they let him out of town. But the other thing is that Jesus chose synagogues as a primary element of his ministry. To share the good news, the kingdom of heaven is near. Change your minds and turn to God. The good news he did in synagogues. Could have done it anywhere. But he chose these community centers, these public centers where anybody could come. And we devalue that gift, that opportunity. It's almost like it's so easy for us that we start to nitpick it. We become picky. But we just don't see that with Jesus. So I want us to look at church with new eyes. If it was good enough for Jesus, then it's definitely good enough for us to develop this habit of being with the people of God. May God bless.